Hi there, my name's Jerry Freeman, although that's how I go by, but actually my real name is Melvin Jerome Freeman. I was born on May 3rd, 1929 here in Omaha at the Methodist Hospital over on 36th and Cumming Street. And my parents were Celia and Joe Freeman. At that time, they lived when I was a baby at 34th and Dodge Street. And as I tell you where all I lived, you'll realize I never lived more than 8 blocks from Dodge Street in my life. 43rd and Marcy, which is a block off 11th Street. Then we went from there to 56th and Howard, 5601 Howard Street. It's still there. I go by it every once in a while. And by then, of course, I was old enough to go to grade school, so I went to Washington School, which is just south of Leavenworth on 56th or 55th. I went there for 3 years, kindergarten, first, second grade. Then we moved into the house that I remember the best and I grew up in. It was at 309 South 51st Street, just off of Farnham. Then I transferred to Dundee Grade School, and I went there until I graduated in 1943. It was there that I started meeting all kinds of guys and women that some of whom are still friends of mine. I was just talking on the phone to Don Nog, and he was in my class there, and Lloyd Arkin and Dick Comer and Orville Milder and Alan Tully was not there. Anyway, I won't name them all, but there were many, many people. Barbara Blacker, Evelyn Rice, and Barbara Taxman, Joanne Rips. A lot of these people are still in Omaha, and I remember them well from grade school. After that, my parents actually moved to 304 South 57th Street. That was just off of Farnham. However, by then I had left the house and was in college or the Air Force. So I actually never lived there. Let's see. After living on Farnham, by then I had gone away to school, which was the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Started there in the fall of 47. Graduated June of 1951 with a degree in economics, bachelor's degree. While there I lived in a dormitory the first year. The second and third years I lived in the Z to BT fraternity house on Washington Avenue. Then during my fourth year, we got married, and I'll talk about that later probably, to Joanne Levy. And we got a little apartment and lived in Ann Arbor. After that, I graduated in June of that year, got a commission as a lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force, and was called to active duty immediately. We then moved to Selfridge Air Force Base, which was outside Detroit. We lived there a while. Then I got transferred to Offutt. I was there for 2 years. Meantime, we moved into an apartment, moving back to Omaha, 3106 Dodge Street, which was called the Turner Court Apartments, and there were all kinds of young people that were living there. I think we lived in the same apartment as a couple, Norton and Myra Guerin, and various other, I think Don Van and his wife Gloria lived there at one time. And we lived there, and then we moved to an apartment on 49th and Davenport Street. And that's when we had our first child. His name is Robert Bob Freeman. That was like in 1953. I was still in the Air Force, and he was born in the Air Force Hospital. Then we bought a house, and I'm sitting in it right now. It's a 6934 Burt. We moved here in, I think, 1956. A couple of weeks after we moved here, our other son was born, John Freeman. That was 56. Our daughter Ellen was born here also. That was in 1959. And all three of the children that I'm talking about, who are, of course, grown up now, but they all still live in Omaha. We had this house, and 1975 was a very memorable year because a lot of things happened to us. In particular, the one that was probably the most dramatic was the tornado in May, I think it was May 5th, 1975. A big wind hit. Tornado came right across the middle of Omaha, across 72nd Street. hit Temple Israel, hit Lewis and Clark Junior High, where Joanne was a teacher, librarian there, and smacked right into our house, blew it away. I had been working at the time, came home, and there was Joanne out in the front yard, and there was no house. It was pretty devastating. However, in the rubble, I found the plans, and it had been built by the Peterson brothers, and I gave the plans to a friend of mine named Fred Holmstrom. And in 6 months, Fred rebuilt the house, and it's still here, and we're still living here. And that, I think it was November that we actually moved back into the house. Meantime, we had moved. A friend of mine at the time was Millard Margolin, now deceased, but he lived right behind me, and his wife, Joan, and their 4 kids were all about the same age as ours. Anyway, Millard owned Landmark Apartments in 93rd and Western, so he gave us a very nice guy and very nice to us. Anyway, we lived rent-free there for about 6 months. The getting back to grade school, there I was a pretty happy guy, and we enjoyed going to school, and Dundee was a great place to go. There was a lot of Jewish kids there, and sometimes I'm asked if there was anti-Semitism, and there probably was, but it wasn't overt, and everybody sort of kept to their own way. I had a lot of friends, I'll name some of them in a second, but the other kids that weren't Jewish sort of stuck to themselves. But in the summertime we got all together and we would play baseball. But I was friendly with a guy named Lamar Guerin, who's left Omaha, but he was my best friend not only through Dundee but Central High. And this guy named Jimmy Weiss, who long since gone, Orville Milder, Lloyd Arkin, a guy named Joe Pollock, who I think died a few years ago. And we all rode our bicycles and played kick the can and that kind of stuff. While I was there, we had a house next door. We were at 309, and the house at 307 South 51st always seemed to have somebody Jewish in there. There was Jerry Rosen lived there at one time, who's now was later married Sheila Pradell Rosen, and he's died a few years back. And then the Nog family moved in, Ernie and Ruthie Nog, and they had 2 kids, Barbara Nog and Alan Nog. Barbara Nog is now Barbara Frankel. They lived there, and I went through my tribulations with them and was probably not too nice to them because I was older, and I probably did various bad things to them, but they seem to have survived. Then a guy moved in named Harold Cooperman, and he had a kid named Francie, who I think to this day probably hates me because I gave her a really bad time. But Harold is the man that owns No Frill Supermarket, and I just saw him the other day. He's at the Blumkin home now. But Harold was a great guy and a great neighbor. And those houses are still around. And believe it or not, I think my father probably paid, I don't know what, but probably very little for that house, and they're selling for like $175,000, which I did see in real estate transfers. But anyway, in grade school I was pretty active. I think I was president of my class, 4th grade, 6th grade, and 8th grade. And then I went on to Central High, and in those days there were fraternities there. They were probably started in competition with the non-Jewish fraternities. There were Leabu and TK were the non-Jewish fraternities. So the Jewish kids had AZA, there was AZA 1, AZA 100, AZA 7, Council Bluffs, but there were 2 others that were not affiliated with the AZA. One was called Rono, and one was called Pi Tau Pi. Now I was the Rono, and that was honor spelled backward. And it had been around for a long time, had a lot of tradition. And I became real active in Rono. I was a diehard Rono and later became president of it. We had a lot of fun. It was very social. And then there were athletic teams where we'd play football and baseball in the spring and all kinds of other stuff, and played against the AZA teams and the Pies, and they were very competitive. The Ronos in my year were myself and Lamar, who I mentioned earlier, and Mayor Moskowitz, who became a doctor and is now deceased, Leon Wintrobe, who's around in Omaha still, and Richie Rosenblatt, who left Omaha and married a girl named Fox, and lives in Chicago, and became affiliated with Hef and Hef Cough Drops. Some of the other guys that were around, my cousin Harvey Davis was a senior, and he's now deceased. Norton Guerin, Hubie Rosenblum, Shelley Harris, Don Rice, Dave Rice, Stan Lipsey, not the Stan Lipsey that married Dottie, Norman Rothman, Norman Block, Jonathan Goldstein, Edward Zorinsky, who later became a U.S. Senator and mayor of Omaha, was a Rono, Don Stern, Arnie Stern, and after me my brother became a Rono, and he had jillions of friends, Floyd Abramson, Jerry Cattleman, Bob Zlotke, who's now a cousin of mine through marriage, Dean Frankel, Jerry Vinger, and so on and so forth. I mean, there were just a lot of kids, and they were very strong. And later on, the schools got on to the fact that there shouldn't have been fraternities, and I think Dick Rochman, who's a friend of mine, was the last Brono president. He got called into J. Arthur Nelson's office at Central High and said, no more. And that was the end of the fraternities, as far as the Jewish fraternities, and that was probably in the late 40s or probably early 50s, 50, 51, something like that. And Central High, I was in ROTC, which I thought was great. And Central High to me was a wonderful school, met a lot of great people, and very social. There were all kinds of dances and athletic stuff, and we had bowling leagues, and there was a bowling alley across from Central called the Music Box, right on 19th to 20th on Capitol. The JCC in those days was on the corner of 20th and Dodge, so as you walked out of Central High, you were at the J, and everybody would sit around there. And I got to high school probably got a ride with my father in the morning, and took the bus home or hitchhiked a ride. Then when I was a senior, I had an uncle that went into World War II named Harry Lynn, who's still alive and well at age 96 now, but he couldn't use his car anymore, so he had a Chevrolet Coupe, Fleetline, I think it was. And he gave this car to me, so I had this car when I was a senior and a few years afterwards, so I was lucky, and I was able to get around town and go to school in a car which had a new kind of transmission that had a flip switch kind of shift. And let's see, my father and mother both were born in Omaha. No, my father was not born in Omaha. My mother was born in Omaha. We'll go to my mother first. My mother was named Gadinsky, and her family was from Kansas City, Missouri. Her father was John B. Gadinsky. He was born, I think, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and became a pharmaceutical salesman. So he moved to Kansas City, and he used to travel in I can remember very vividly, a 38 Oldsmobile, gray four-door sedan, and he traveled Nebraska and Kansas and part of Iowa selling things to drugstores or pharmacies. He married my grandmother, whose name was Sophie, and I think her maiden name was Linsons. And they lived in Kansas City. They always had an apartment, usually on the just south of the plaza. And they had five children. My mother had two sisters, and both of them died very early. One died, I think, like in grade school, and one died when she was like 20 years old. And the two brothers never lived in Omaha. My other uncle I referred to with the car, he eventually moved to Washington, D.C., and then on to Florida, where he retired. And my other uncle was named Floyd, and he changed his name to Giddens, Floyd Giddens. And in the 30s, he had graduated from Kansas University with an engineering degree. Jobs were tough in the 30s, so he became a Reserve Army officer with the CCC, it was called, Civilian Conservation Corps, and he worked around in the Midwest. They were building various projects. So as soon as the war came, because he was a reserve officer, he went into the Army as an engineer, and he got to the rank of full colonel, and eventually stayed in the Army after the war, and had one child named Margene, who lives in Memphis, Tennessee now, and he eventually retired, and he passed away many years ago, and his wife, Marion, also passed away. My other uncle that I mentioned by then the family had moved to Omaha, and my uncle that I referred to as Harry, now named Harry Lynn, as he changed his name also, he graduated Central in 1924. My mother graduated Central, I'm not sure what year, but probably in the late 20s. So we have a heritage of Central High. My mother went there, my uncle went there, I went there, Joanne went there, and we skipped. My kids didn't go there, but my three grandchildren, two have gone to Central and graduated, and one is going to go there next year, Susan Freeman. Let's see. My grandparents have now, on that side, on my mother's side, they're both deceased. My grandfather died a long time ago. My grandmother died, so she lived to be, I think, in her 90s, and she lived in the Dr. Philip Scher home, which is now the Blumkin home. It was on 52nd Street, just north of Ames, and it was for Jewish older people. And she lived there a long time, and we used to go out and see her all the time. That, by the way, it was called the Dr. Philip Scher home, and it was named after Dr. Philip Scher, who was a relative of mine on my father's side. And he lived also on 51st Street, between Dodge and Farnham on the west side of the street. On my father's side, my father was born in Camden, New Jersey, and the family lived in Camden and in Philadelphia. And they moved to Omaha in, I think, the late teens, like 1918 or 19 or early 20s. And his parents were Harry Lewis Freeman and Minnie Sachs Freeman. And they were alive when I was born, which was, of course, 1929, but they died when I was just a little kid. And I really have no memory of them. They were, I just don't remember them at all, other than I've seen pictures of them. But anyway, they had, I think, they had 6 children. My father being one of the middle kids. And my father, Joseph H. Freeman, came to Omaha because a uncle had come. You heard the word Sachs in there. Through marriage, a guy named Abraham Sachs came to Omaha and bought out a place called Eastern Woolen Company. And my father went to work for him, but I'll get back to that. I'll go into the other relatives. There were, remind me to go back there myself. The other brothers were David Freeman, who was a bachelor all his life, and he also went into this business. And later, he bought out a company in Chicago called Bishop Freeman G.H. Bishop Company. He changed it to Bishop Freeman. And he was a manufacturer of things for the dry cleaning industry, and he did very well, won an E award during World War II. And he died, I think, maybe in the 1960s in Chicago, never married. The other uncle, my father's brother, was Mike Freeman. And Mike was also in this business, and he was married eventually to Ruthie Rosenstein. They had 2 daughters, Sally and Lori Freeman. Now both are married, and they both live in Colorado. There were 3 sisters. The oldest sister was Eva, and she married Sam Davis. Her name then was Eva Davis. They had 3 children. David Davis, who's still around, lives in Omaha. And his brother Harvey, who also was in Omaha and married and he eventually moved and went to work for my uncle, and he moved to Chicago. And Harvey, who had married, his wife's name was Gloria, they had 2 kids, but Harvey died about maybe in their late, I'd say maybe around 1995 or so. He died while playing tennis in Florida, so he is not around. And, okay, Harvey had also had a sister. Her name was Lee Davis. She went to Central High, and I remember her because she had a couple of friends, Mickey Rosenblatt and Larry Robinson. They were commonly known as the Big Three when I was around there. She was like a year ahead of me, graduated Central, I think, in 46. She married a man named Eddie Siegeloff, spent most of her years in St. Louis, and then later they moved to Melbourne, Florida, where she still lives, and he died about, I think in the year 2003, he passed away. And they have 2 daughters. One lives in Missouri, and one lives in Melbourne. And as I mentioned, they have an older brother who lives in Florence home in the assisted living, and he never did marry. The other sister of my father was Anne Freeman, and she married, believe it or not, a guy named Arthur Freeman, so her name became Anne Freeman, and she lived on South 24th Street, about 24th and D, and then later they moved to like 43rd and Shirley, and then later they moved to one of Millard Margolin's apartments about 93rd, maybe Burt Street or so. And Arthur Freeman was from Chicago, and he was an optometrist, and he had an office downtown at one time on 15th and Dodge, and then I think about 15th and Farnham. And he was a balloonist in World War I, and was stationed at Fort Omaha. Now, how they met exactly, I'm not sure, but he did have other relatives in Omaha. I think the Friedmans, that Willard Friedman is somehow related to him, and his father, J.J., was somehow related to Arthur Friedman. Now, they had one daughter. Her name was Minda Friedman, and she married a man in Omaha named Werner Levy. And Werner and Minda lived about 158th, 59th, or 60th, north of Center Street. And they lived there for many years. And then they retired and moved to Tampa, Florida. And within the last months, which this is now, as I'm talking, October of 2004, and within the last few months, Minda actually passed away. She was age 69, and Werner's there. Now, they had 2 children, and a boy and a girl. The other sister, her name was Lil Freeman, and she married a guy named Herb Neville. Neviloff was his name. He changed it to Neville. And he was from an old family in Omaha that I think his mother was, I think her name was Sadie Neviloff, and she was a big worker in the community and was pretty well known, and I've seen her name and plaques around where she did a lot of work for various Jewish causes. And her son, who became my uncle by marriage, was probably the craziest, wildest Jewish guy that ever walked the streets of Omaha. I mean, he was a wild man. He was a mechanic type guy. He always had cars that he liked to drive 100 miles an hour or faster. One car he had was called a Chrysler Airflow. It was like a 1938 Chrysler Yellow. And he was known for driving it like crazy all the time. And his career was interesting. He had a place out in North. They lived in Minnelusa, he and my aunt, Lil. They lived in Minnelusa, about, I think it was 27th and Vane. And he owned a battery shop, I think it was around 16th and Commercial Avenue or Ames. And then the war came, World War II. So he was such a good mechanic that he somehow talked his way into a commission. He went into the Army as a captain and became a maintenance officer in England. And at that after the war, he got out, and he and my aunt, or his wife, moved to California, and they had 2 children. One is named Skip Neville, who lives in California and is now the owner of a plastic factory, and he married and has children. And his sister was Sonia or Sunny, and she lives in California. Although she lives in Northern California, Skip lives in LA. But after the war, my uncle Herb went to work in the dry cleaning industry, and at one time worked for my uncle that was in Chicago, and he was a salesman and went all over the country. And he was also one of the world's greatest salesmen. He was unbelievable. He sold things to us down at Saks Freeman Company. Then he started a plastics factory, and they made plastic bags, the kind of bags you see on a dry cleaning when you send your suit to the dry cleaners and it comes back in a clear plastic bag. So he started this factory, and they became pretty big in that. It's called Diamond Poly Industries. And he died many, many years back, but his son Skip runs this factory and is still in that. Getting back to the company, or Saks Freeman as it's known. This, when I first remembered it, it was Eastern Woolen Company, and it was on I think it was 117 South 17th Street. It was just south of Dodge and across the west side of the street from Medical Arts Building. And I've got pictures of this going back to Golden Spike days. And my uncle, my great uncle, Saks, was the owner of the business, and he used to walk around with a green eye shade. Yeah, I think he had poor vision also. And slowly as the years went on, my uncle and his 2 brothers, my uncle Mike, my uncle Dave, and my father owned the business. As I mentioned earlier, my uncle Dave left and he got out of the business, went to Chicago, but the thing evolved into my father, Joe, and his brother, Mike. They owned this Eastern Woolen Company. Well, as the years went on, they were in tailor trimmings, and they got out of that and slowly evolved into selling things to dry cleaners and laundries and tailors. And in the process, they changed the name to Saks Freeman Company. And as things grew and World War II ended, and they started selling, instead of selling just needles and pins and buttons and threads and scissors and Scotch tape and all the little stuff, there was a big need for people to have equipment in dry cleaning. So they took on various lines of dry cleaning equipment and became distributors for, in most cases, the states of Nebraska and Iowa for some of the big names in the industry, which would mean nothing to most people, but like Ajax presses and Vic cleaning machines and Dietrich cleaning machines and Latner boilers and Sissel equipment and Hipsch dryers, and from that they branched out into coin laundries, and we sold things to coin laundries. As the supply business got, when I say supplies, I mean things that are consumable, like plastic bags and filter powder and all that. We were selling into like Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, Missouri. We had people. When I say we, after being in the Air Force, which was 1953, I came in and I became part of the business. I started out as doing various things to learn what was going on, and then I became the salesman in the city of Omaha, and I called on all the various dry cleaners, tailors and laundries and coin laundries, and got to know all the different people. And later on, I became in charge of the whole consumable supply part of the business. And we went in, as we were selling equipment, why it was a sort of a vicious circle. You sold more, you wanted to sell more. So to create more of a market, because our market there's only so many people in Nebraska and Iowa and around here, so we developed a franchise called 1 Hour Sunkissed Cleaners. And we had, by this time, we had hired various sales engineers or engineers, layout people, and we would create a dry cleaning plant from scratch. We would equip it, figure out, go into a shopping center and lease the place, put in a dry cleaning plant, get it installed, get it running, and then sell it to somebody. And we had I think 35 different plants that were not only in Iowa and Nebraska, but we were all the way down into Arkansas and Indiana, Wisconsin, and this got us into the big time, so to speak. And it probably was also the beginning of the end of this company, because we got in, I'd say, now that it's all back, and I can look back at it, probably in over our heads. The main problem was we were selling a system that was using a new kind of solvent called Valclean. It had been developed by DuPont. We were the distributors not only of the DuPont solvent, but we were distributors of the only machine in the whole country that could use it, which was a Valclean machine made by the Vic Manufacturing up in Minneapolis. Well, we had nothing but headaches with this machine. It would run, but it didn't always run. So we were sending guys like to Indianapolis, Indiana on service calls, and this became very expensive. And we had grown from a company of maybe 20 people to 40-some people. Now, as the years went on, there were always relatives in this business. It became a place where various Freeman relatives could work. One of the most productive guys was a first cousin of mine, not first cousin, second cousin of mine named Phil Freeman. Phil Freeman was an engineer type guy, and he was a salesman for many years and then became a sales engineer and an equipment specialist, could also troubleshoot machinery and all that. And Phil eventually left our company, went to work as an engineer for J.L. Brandeis. Phil is now, I think, 91 years old and lives at the Blumkin home out on 132nd between Dodge and Pacific. And his wife, Min, passed away within the last year, which would be in the year 2000. His sister was named Myrtle Freeman, also a second cousin of mine. Myrtle was a single woman, and she always worked at our place, and she was always in the office doing various, I'll put it this way, she always ended up with jobs nobody else wanted to do, but she was very good at it, always was bringing down cookies and candy for everybody, and she was just a great girl, and unfortunately never married and passed away. I lost track, but before her time, I'd say she was probably in her 50s or 60s when she died. And then she had another brother and Phil. His name was David Freeman also. Dave Freeman went to work for my uncle in Chicago, and he was also sort of an engineer type guy. And he worked in the factory. He was like superintendent of their manufacturing. And he died. He moved back to Omaha into a nursing home, and he died, I'd say, about 1990 maybe. And he also never married. To differentiate him from my Uncle Dave, they called him Sergeant Dave. Now, I'm not sure where the name came from, but I think in the Army he was. Now these two Freemans, Dave and Phil, they were horses of a different color for Jewish kids. They were very non-Jewish. I'm not sure they ever belonged to a synagogue in Omaha. They grew up in Council Bluffs. They lived out on North 8th Avenue. I remember going there when I was a kid. And their father, Charlie Freeman, had a grocery store. And I remember going there in the 1930s, and it was way back when they had chickens in the backyard of grocery stores. And I don't think they had a horse and wagon, but I don't think they had a car in those days. And Phil and David Freeman were like hunters type guys. They were always going up into the hills around Council Bluffs and shooting squirrels and rabbits and that kind of thing. I mean, they were real different from the people that I knew on this side of the river. And the other people that worked at Sachs Freeman, I guess, so if from talking over the years, although I don't remember it. My Aunt Ann, I guess, worked there. And my kids eventually would work there sometimes in the summertime, never as a full-time deal, but they used to drive our truck and make deliveries in Omaha. And I remember them doing it. They still talk about it once in a while. Getting into these, we had 3 children, Joanne and I. Getting back to how did I meet Joanne? Well, that was sort of osmosis. I always went to Bethel, went to Hebrew school there. Bethel in those days was 49th. And Farnham, I was bar mitzvahed in 1942, Rabbi Goldstein, Cantor Edgar. And one of the people that went there was Joanne. Her name was Joanne Levy, lived on 45th and Hickory. Didn't know her from grade school, but knew her from Bethel, sort of. I mean, I just sort of knew who she was. She was a good friend of, her best friend was named Audrey Greenberg, now Audrey Cohn. And I knew Audrey well because my parents were friends of hers. So somehow over the years I got to know Joanne through Audrey. And in high school I started taking her out to various parties and so on. And eventually we started really going together, and we got pinned. And we stayed as going steady like through high school, like the last year of high school. And then we separated as I went off to school in Ann Arbor and she was in Columbia. But somehow we stayed together. We got married in 1950 at the Fontenelle Hotel, actually at Bethel, and we went to the Fontenelle Hotel, which for reception. So we, as I was in the service back at Sachs Freeman, but we did have 3 children. The oldest is Bob, and Bob was born in 53. Bob went to school at Nebraska, went to Westside High, Nebraska University, then went to law school at Hastings College of Law, which is part of the University of California, and he has graduated there as a lawyer. He's now a lawyer in Omaha, and lives on 65th and Underwood, which is only a few blocks from us. He is married to Robin, and they have 3 children, Allie, Lauren, and Susan. And then we have John, who was born in 1956, and he went to Westside High, and he went to Nebraska U and was pledged the same fraternity as Bob, which was Sigma Alpha Mu. But he didn't stay in Lincoln. He ended up coming back and graduated from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. John has been in various sales capacities over the years, and at one time lived in Plano, Texas, and one is in San Antonio, Texas, but is now back in Omaha. He married Teresa Thomas, and they had 2 children, Alex Freeman and Adam Freeman. And Alex and Adam are both in college now. And Alex lives in Omaha, and Adam is down in Lincoln as a senior at Nebraska. And John still lives in Omaha and does work in sales, lives on 46th and Wakely. Our youngest is Ellen, and Ellen, whose name is back to Freeman, and Ellen went to Westside High and graduated, and she then went to University of Iowa for like a year, but she did not stay in Iowa. She came back and was working in Omaha at various things, and she over the years became a legal secretary, then a paralegal, and she worked doing that for many, many years and still does that, and now works for a banking holding company where she is in their office. And she married Steve Syroff, and they were married for 10 years, but they are no longer married, and she is now single and changed her name back to Freeman and lives in the Regency high-rise apartments. And we now come to the children, and I won't go into a lot of detail there. They're some in college, and 3 are in college, and 4 are in college, and 1 is a junior, what is now middle school, but it used to be junior high at Lewis and Clark. Joanne, after our kids got to be in high school, went back to college. She had 2 years at Missouri, finished at UNO, got a degree in library, went to work for the Omaha Public Schools, worked for 22 years as the librarian at Lewis and Clark Junior High, which is right across the street from us. Then about 1992 she retired, and now is fully retired from school. But while there, she was teacher to many, many. In those days, there were a lot of kids that lived around here, a neighborhood east of here called Bagel. So she was the teacher to a lot of kids that had been around town. One is a movie producer, believe it or not. And so she had fun and a good career, and is now happily retired. After the Sachs Freeman Company closed in 1972, I believe. And at that point, I started out a new career. I went into insurance sales. I was with Guardian Life Insurance for, I don't know how many years, but at least 10. And maybe longer than that. And also, back then, I became not enamored with that business, but I tried to stay with it. And at that time, I was approached by, I think it was Jan Winthrop, who owned Omaha Lace Laundry, and her husband Ernie. They wanted somebody to take over the Nebraska Dry Cleaners Association. They had a guy that had been in it for like 40 years, and I think he passed away. So I thought, now that's something right up my alley, and I got into that. I became the executive secretary of the Nebraska Dry Cleaners Association. We later changed the name to Nebraska Fabric Care Association. And I did that, which was a part-time deal, but I did that along with insurance for years, and I quit insurance altogether and did the Nebraska Fabric Care, as that was the only thing I did for a living, but it was not a full-time job, and I did it. And in that capacity, I did almost all the work that there was to do. I solicited memberships, collected the dues, invested the money that we took in, paid myself, planned all the conventions and sales meetings and seminars, brought in speakers, lobbied for the various legislation that we needed to lobby about in Lincoln or Omaha. Planned all the conventions. Probably the thing I got the most kick out of was the newsletter. I published the newsletter. I wrote it, edited it, and printed it, mailed it. And it was a gossipy but informative type of newsletter. It won awards for being the best one in the country. And I started using some of the journalism I'd learned from Miss Savage at Central High School. So I retired from that. We worked out a deal where the Iowa Association took over for the Nebraska Association. And I think my last year was probably maybe 1996 or 6 or 7 years ago from now. So that now I am fully retired. Now, part of my problem was that I always got into things that were time-consuming and that I loved, probably more than working for making money. The first thing I was in was called Little League Baseball, and I got into that hot and heavy. I used to spend jillions of hours on that per week in the season. I was the manager. I was the player agent, which recruited the players, the managers, and set up the schedules and the teams. And we had 24 teams at 3 levels. And I did that for a couple of years. Then I got into managing, and I had what they call a major league team. And 2 of my kids were on it. So I did that for like 5 or 6 years, and that was fun. And I got a big kick out of that. Then back in 1966, I started playing tennis. That was the year that opened the indoor tennis court started. They built Hanscom. A guy named Frank Vocek started an indoor tennis league, and I, along with my buddy Jerry Cohn, heard about it, called up Frank Vocek and said, hey, we'd like to play tennis. Now, we didn't know up from down about tennis because the last time I had played was in grade school down at Dewey with a guy named Lamar Guerin and Orville Milder out at the tennis club on Happy Hollow. And I had just got away from it completely. But we found out that we could get in this league, and it was on, I think it was on Tuesday nights at Hanscom, which was a brand new indoor facility with 4 courts, and they later added 4 more to make it 8. Well, there was a little problem. It was called B'nai B'rith bowling. We were both doing that. But I was utterly bored with it. I was not a great bowler, and I just, I'd go there, and everybody else had a grocery store that was in the league, but I didn't. And one year I had a good team with guys I knew that were Justin Horwich and Alan Wolfson and Jerry, I forget his last name now, but anyway, we had a fun team, but most of the time I did not enjoy it. So we dropped the B'nai B'rith bowling and went to tennis. Well, I like tennis, and I started running a league myself that was on Saturday afternoons, and I started getting into running tennis tournaments, became director of the various tournaments, or assistant director, and then I ran for the Omaha Tennis Association Board of Directors. I got elected. I got to be vice president. Eventually I got to be the president for a couple of years, and I just was doing all kinds of stuff that was related to tennis. Eventually we started a tennis hall of fame way back many years ago, and eventually, I think in 1992, I was inducted into it myself for the work I'd done in tennis. And I still play tennis 4 times a week, and in the wintertime when we're in Florida, I play like almost every day, and we enjoy it. The other thing that I got into was bicycling. Now that happened sort of by osmosis also. I hadn't ridden a bike since college. I did ride a bike there, and I remember leaving my bike in Ann Arbor, and I went back to get it, and it was gone. So I don't know who's got it, and I don't know what happened to it. But I was playing tennis back 20 years ago with Bus Schlossberg, and he had a friend named Stuart Simon, and Stuart Simon lived up the hill from us on 68th and Bird, and Bus would always be nagging me I should ride my bike because Stuart rides, he's got nobody to ride with. So finally he got to me, and I said, I'll ride. And I called up Stuart, and he told me to meet him on 68th and Burt Street on 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday probably in May. So I found an old bike that was laying around from when our kids went to UNO. And I got it out, put air in the tires. I met Stuart Simon, and we rode 10 miles back, came back, and I got into a hot tub and thought I was going to die. Then he called me up next week, and he said, hey, I said, hey, I like that, that's fun, I like to ride. And I started riding, and Stuart and I would ride every single Saturday and Sunday the same route, 10 miles, and we'd end up going over north through Benson, then back toward Center Street. And we did this for years, the two of us. And then Arnold Stern started riding, and so he'd ride with us, and then I started riding with Arnold. We'd meet in Elmwood Park and ride through the city. Now in those days there weren't any bike trails, and so we'd have to ride on the street. And then Arnie's wife, Rocky, started riding, and she would meet with us sometimes. Then a friend of mine, Jack Cohn, started riding, and we would ride on weekends, and then we'd go out. Jack liked to ride out in the country, so we'd go out in the country around Valley, Fremont, Waterloo, Council Bluffs, and we'd take these long bike rides out in the streets and almost get hit by cars all the time, but somehow he survived, and I've survived so far. And we found that a few other people we knew liked the idea of biking, so I think Arnold, myself, and Jack came up with the idea of riding on Wednesday nights, going to a restaurant, and we'd meet at the restaurant and then ride our bikes for a couple hours and then eat. And we made up a name for this group called Wheels to Meals. I don't think we made it up. I think one of our friends made it up. Could have been Susan Rothels, but I'm not sure. And anyway, we called it Wheels to Meals. We made up schedules, and we started getting couples. And Joanne, who hadn't ridden, started riding, and Jack's wife, Marcia, started riding, and we had a hardcore of people that were riding and liked it. Well, word got around town, and pretty soon, instead of having 10 or 20 people, we started getting 40 people. Of course, they weren't always there all the time, and I made up a list with phone numbers, and eventually we had about 60 people that were floating in and out of this group, and it sort of got out of hand. So we're still doing this, and but it's down to maybe 20 people, and of course they don't all show up all the time, so we have maybe anywhere from 12 to 16 that still ride. And the Omaha World Herald just did a story on us that was in the paper October 15th or so on a Saturday. And we got a lot of nice feedback on that. So we're still doing that. Now I ride, of course I don't need 20 people to ride. That's the beauty of riding. I ride my bike all the time. And we have some people that I ride with, like on Friday, we have a group that rides every Saturday morning, meets downtown at the diner right around the airport. And we have a group that meets every Sunday. We meet at various places, ride for a couple hours, and then go out to eat. And so we have people that do that, Redlers and Dick Rochman and Rocky Stern and Castmans, Denenbergs, Jerry Vinger, Jerry Dan, Donald Nog, Justin Horwich are some, and I'm sure I haven't named everybody, but they still ride quite a bit with us. Renee Kasner, Susan Rothels, and Suzanne Singer. And those people are still riding pretty much with us a lot. And there's others that Doris Cohn started riding with us. But that's pretty much the story of the riding, and that, of course, between that and tennis, the way that keeps me sort of busy, and our kids and all that. And luckily, I mentioned Florida. About 12 years ago, Joanne retired. We started going to Florida, a place called Hallandale, which is a great place because it's like 90% Jewish. And we have various friends there, and the reason we picked Hallandale, which is an odd place because most people don't go to Arizona or California, but friends of ours, Alan and Betsy Tully, had a condo in Hallandale, and when we were still working, Joanne was still a librarian. Every 2 weeks in the winter when she had no school, we would go down as guests of Alan and stay at their place. And we were there for 2 weeks and usually met Barbara and Jerry Cohn. And we liked it. I mean, we liked the area, we liked being there, we liked the weather. So once we had a chance to go there and spend more time, we decided that we liked going to Hallandale, and we do go there. Well, a typical day for me is not moving too fast, but we do stuff. I personally get up, and I don't know where it comes from, but I have a certain amount of office work or paperwork that I do, and I do that for an hour or so. And I have what they call web TV, but you can get on the internet and do email, and I do that for a half hour every day. I find email to be a great way to keep in touch with people. Anyway, I get going, and every morning I usually have a tennis game that I go to. And in the wintertime, we play indoors at Hanscom. And then, of course, I go to Florida in the later part of winter. In the summertime, we play either at Dewey Park or an apartment house, or I play in a league on Monday at the Coke Tennis Center at 120th and West Maple Road. Then if it's a decent weather, I ride my bike. I'll come home and ride it, or I'll go from tennis directly to riding, or I'll ride later on Wednesdays. We meet with the group. On Friday, I ride my bike usually with Justin or Jack Cohn or Don Nog or whoever's around. And Saturday morning, we have a group that rides, and every Sunday we ride, and I've mentioned their names already. So Joanne gets up every morning on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday goes to the Manual Hospital, and there she's in an aerobic swimming class. And she goes out and does various luncheon stuff, and like I think today went to a meeting at the J about the Federation Library. She was active on the Federation Library Board, was active with Friends of the Library. But right now, I don't think she's any one thing she's doing, but she reads a lot, and I read a lot. And I'm a big sports and baseball fan. I go to the Omaha Royals day games in the summer. We have a group that does that. I'm not one into eating a lot. I know a lot of people go out to eat lunch and all that. I don't do that too often. Once in a while I do meet friends for lunch. And our big thing is probably going to eat and go to movies and symphony and plays and that kind of thing. So that's basically how we spend our time. One thing we've done, we just did it about 2 weeks ago, we get in our car and go to some little place in Nebraska or Iowa and spend the night sightseeing and riding our bikes and maybe pick out a bed and breakfast and eat food and all that. So now it may sound like I don't do a heck of a lot, but I mean I do stay busy and I don't run out of stuff. I'm always reading something or other. And I'm a big fan of the paper, and I get involved in certain social issues that I get hot and heavy on. I write to the Public Pulse and the World Herald on various issues, and most of the time they print it, and sometimes they don't. And I'm usually writing my city councilman, Mark Kraft, or one of the other ones, about various issues that I either agree or don't agree with on, like Ernie Chambers' name being used to name a city park, which I'm violently against. But so I get up and riled about things. I'm an advocate for bike safety. I was very heavily involved in having children, when they're riding bikes, wear helmets. I tried to get a law passed in the city. It never did happen, but it's still on the back burner. So I'm usually got some kind of a cause I'm on. Right now I'm doing some work for the Tennis Association. And I do write a column for the Omaha Tennis Association has a newsletter. And since from the day one when I was no longer president, I felt that I had a voice to offer that offered an insight into what's going on in my opinions and a reporter's point of view. And so I write a column, I've won an award for that from the Nebraska Tennis Association. And I'm still writing that. And once again, Miss Savage at Central High was my mentor on that, and that was a long. Well, most people that have grandchildren are hot and enthused about them, and we're lucky. We do have grandchildren. We do have 5, and each one is a special person to us. And over the years, most of them have been involved in various athletic things, and we always make it a point to go to see their softball or baseball or soccer or whatever, basketball. And most of them are old enough, so we're sort of out of that, except for our youngest one. But I'll mention the oldest grandchild is Adam Freeman, and he's now 21 years old. He's a senior at Nebraska, and he lives in Lincoln, and he's from John and Tree Freeman. And Adam is our only son, a grandson, and we had a lot of pleasure out of Adam because he was always an athlete of various things, mostly in baseball and basketball. He was a varsity basketball point guard for Millard North and was a good hardball player, although he never made the super varsity level, but he was a good player in his day, and we went to all his games and got a lot of kick out of that. He's majoring in journalism and broadcast journalism, and he'll graduate next June from Nebraska. Also the same age as Adam, but I think a couple months younger, is Allison Jo Freeman, commonly known as Allie. Allie is from Bob and Robin Freeman. She's now a senior at Northwestern, and she's also in journalism. She was a graduate of Central High in Omaha, and she's also was a varsity tennis player at Central High all 4 years. And we went to see most of her matches. And she's a just completed being a princess at XR Bend, which was this last weekend, so we were very proud of her for that. And she was in her journalism work, she was a intern out at San Francisco Magazine last fall for Northwestern's journalism school, and this summer she was a intern for Senator Nelson, Ben Nelson, Nebraska, in Washington, and last year she worked for Mayor Fahey. And she's worked as a tennis instructor around town, and she works at Regency in the tennis shack there on weekends. So she will graduate next June. The third oldest is Lauren Freeman from Bob and Robin also. And Lauren went to Central High and was a super student there, was like, I think, ranked third in her class. She's now at Washington University in St. Louis, where she's a pre-med or biology, one of the two, and she's a sophomore. And she likes it there, and she's a member of AE Phi sorority, which Joanne was also a member. Lauren was a good athlete, and still, of course, is. And I think she ended up with, 11 letters at Central High. And she was 4 years in tennis, 4 years in swimming, and 3 years as it's not a cheerleader, but it's called the pep squad or something like that, where they do some dancing and cheerleading. And she was on the student council there and won various scholarships, and was a very... we were very happy with Lauren, and the next oldest is Alex. Alex Freeman is now a freshman at Metro Tech here in Omaha. She graduated from Millard North High School, and she's from John and Tree. And Alex has just started living in an apartment in Omaha over on Leavenworth Street with some friends. And she works at one of the coffee shops, and loves doing that. She just started that. I guess she works early in the morning and goes to school the rest of the time and at nights. And Alex did various sports. She played a little bit of tennis, and at one time tried soccer. And she was a cheerleader and in junior high and at Millard North. And Alex is a very social gal and has lots of friends, and has a boyfriend now that's goes back into high school days, and he goes now to Kearney and Nebraska U at Kearney, and is a varsity football player from Westside High and is redshirting it this year. So they have a big social life. And the other granddaughter is Susan Freeman, who's going to be 14 years old in about a month. And she's in the 8th grade at Lewis and Clark. And she'll be headed to Central also next year. And Susan is from Bob and Robin, lives about 2 blocks away, so we see her a lot. And Susan just completed her first year as a soccer player at Lewis Clark, made the team, and I thought had a good year, scored a couple goals in the last 2 games. And we go watch her when she's been playing, and she plays softball every spring, and we go watch her team and her friends. And she's also a musician. I think she plays the violin, and we go to her various concerts and activities. And she was bat mitzvahed about a year ago, and that was a big occasion in the family, and we had all our family in from out of town. And Susan is a good student and very sociable, and we look forward to her high school years. That is the 5 grandchildren, but every one of them is special to us. Now, I didn't do too much mentioning of my brother, but I did have a brother and still have a brother, and I'm very proud of him, because he has been had a very interesting life. He was born in 1932 when we lived on 51st, and we probably lived on 56th and Howard. Anyway, he moved over to 309 South 51st Street, went to Dundee School also, and went to Central High, graduated in 1949 with various other people like Ben Nachman and Sherman Posca, Dean Frankel, Bob Slotky, Derry Vinger, Floyd Abramson, Jerry Cattleman, Doris Ban was her name then, Sonia Baker, and I'm not naming a lot here. I can't think of all of them, and I'll probably leave out some, but there were a lot of kids in there. Some are still around, and some are moved out of town. But Harry was very good at keeping friendships, both in college and high school. So he and Vinger, Zlotke, and the late Arnold Stern would get together, and Dean Frankel still get together for reunions all the time, and they have a good time together. And met in Omaha, and they've met in Dallas. Anyway, Harry, after graduating from Central, went to the University of Michigan, where I was 2 years ahead of him. And he got a degree in, I think, economics, graduated in 49, went down to Lincoln and went to school there for, went to Lincoln to law school there after he graduated in 53, graduated Michigan. Went to law school for 2 years in Lincoln, and he went to Harvard Law School in his last year and graduated there with a degree as a lawyer. Got appointed as a clerk of a federal judge in San Francisco. And he did that for a year, and he traveled through all the 12 western states plus Hawaii. And he made connections in San Francisco, so he became a partner in a law office in San Francisco, which I can't remember the name of the firm, but he was a lawyer there. He got married at that time, and they had a son named Bennett, still named Bennett Freeman, who now lives in Washington. And his first wife, Bennett, was named Thelma Jean Friedman, and then Thelma Jean Freeman. However, they were divorced, and he later married Lucy Carpenter, and they had 3 more children. They had twins, and also a daughter. And these are all grown children now that are around 30 years old or so. And I'll get back to that. Anyway, Harry went on and left the law firm, went to work for Bechtel. It's a big company. He went to work for the Peace Corps type of work, and went went to Africa and to some other countries, and got involved with quasi-government type of work, and became pretty good in international affairs and international traveling, liked to travel, got interested in airplanes, and his career was interesting. He never really was any one place till he somehow landed and was scouted, and exactly how he got involved with them, I really don't know, but he ended up with American Express Company. He became friends with Jim Robinson, who was then the president, where he worked his way up to being executive vice president of American Express. He was like maybe the number 3 man in the company, and they had a headquarters in Washington, he had headquarters in New York City, and Harry, who had since moved to Washington and had a house there. Some of the work he did was out of Washington, but he kept an apartment in New York and would commute home to Washington on weekends. And he stayed with American Express and eventually retired and moved back to Washington full-time. And retired, he started a foundation that he funded and ran himself called the Hastings Foundation. And Harry became an expert in international affairs and particularly in the service industry. I mean, he found ways that they were not being counted on, and there were statistics in that industry were lacking. And he found invented like statistics. He still is active in that, although he's fully retired, but through his foundation he does work in that, and he gives around, not so much of late, but was going around giving speeches. And I remember one time he came to Omaha and gave a speech to some organization out at the Omaha Country Club, and we went out to see him. And getting back to his wife, Lucy, was a college graduate and was also, like Joanne, was a librarian. She worked in Bethesda, Maryland as a county librarian. And she did this up until maybe 1998 or 1999 or so, and then retired. And so Lucy and Harry both retired. The son from the first, from Thelma Jean, is Bennett Freeman, and he's now married and has no children. And he is a consultant. He at one time was in the Clinton administration, wrote speeches for people in the State Department, and was at one time an undersecretary of state for, actually had something to do with the reparations of the Nazis back to the Jewish refugees that ended up in the United States and in Switzerland. So he's now a consultant for a big company back there. The next two children with Harry and Lucy were twins, a boy and a girl. Lansing went to the University of Delaware and graduated. And Lansing is a grade school teacher in Washington, D.C., and I think he teaches like the 6th grade. And he teaches in the summertime. He is a tennis teacher, tennis instructor, and he's very big in sports. He's also a tennis and soccer instructor. He does some color commentary on the television for some of the college games that are done, and basketball and soccer back in that area. He's a very big sports fan, and he can name you, he follows women's pro basketball and college basketball like nobody I've ever run into. Can name you all the players and what they're doing and what happened to them. And he had one team that he sort of sponsored that went into the high school finals in Las Vegas that were for high school athletes that are recruited into the NBA, and all high school kids, but that are big and really good, that had pro futures or college futures. And his sister Rachel is a twin, and Rachel is also had an interesting life and still does. Rachel is married and is now expecting with her first child. And Rachel graduated college and always had something to do with Russia. She learned how to speak Russian, lived in Russia, has been working for the World Bank in Uzbekistan, which is sort of near Russia. And just within the last few weeks, it's transferred to Johannesburg, South Africa, with her husband. And she's working for the World Bank there. But she is able at various times to get around and do business in Russia, in both Moscow and Leningrad. And can speak it and knows her way around, has started businesses and been a consultant and an aide, depending on what job she was with. Anyway, she's starting in South Africa. Now the youngest of Harry Lucy's children is a doctor. Her name is Alexandra. She's also married to Doug, although she's kept the Freeman name. And she went on after college and became a doctor and practiced with the University of Northwestern's Children's Medical School in Chicago, and Doug and Alexandra lived in Chicago up until about June of 2004. And she was accepted with the National Health Institute in Washington. So she's moved back to Washington, and she and Doug have bought a big house back there in one of the suburbs and now live there, and they have one child, who's Nicholas, who's about a year and a half old now. And she has become an expert in infectious diseases for children, has written various papers, and has traveled to Japan to give lectures, and sort of made a name for herself in that as a doctor. So as you can see from what I've said here, that most of that part of the family is in Washington, D.C. or their suburbs, and are living there happily. And of course they come to visit us once in a while. They were all here for the last bat mitzvah in the family, and we go to visit them at the weddings that have happened. And we looked forward to seeing Harry and Lucy and the kids probably within the next couple of months. Where exactly, we're not sure, but that is my story. I can go back on one part of what I talked about to the dry cleaning industry. In many cities, it's very heavily Jewish. That's was not true in Omaha, but there were certain people in that industry that I can recall and mention their names, and I knew all of them, of course. I already mentioned Jan and Ernie Wintrow. They had the Omaha Lace Laundry on 50th and Leavenworth, and they were active, and Jan was president of the Nebraska Fabric Care Association, and I worked under her, and she sort of helped me and got me started in what I was doing, and so I owe her a lot. And they've since retired, and they've sold Ernie was an attorney and never really worked too much at the Lace Laundry, but Jan did full time, and they have since retired. Down the street from them was a place called Half Hour Laundry, and it's still there. It's called Fashion Cleaners, and that was a fellow named Sam Nepomnick, and then later on his nephew Leonard DePort took over. And Leonard is no longer around, but I know his son Dennis is very active at Temple Israel today. And but they're out of the industry. Let's see. There was a place over on Morris Cutler, owned a cleaners over about 18th and Dodge, Teddy Bear Cleaners it was called. And he and his wife Dolly ran that, and that is now closed, and they're no longer active in the business. And then there was one guy that was one of the greatest guys that I knew. Nate Marcus was his name. He just passed away a few years ago, and his wife Bee, and he had a brother, but the brother moved away a long time ago, so I didn't know him as well. They owned a place on 1941 Vinton Street called Beehive Cleaners, and Beehive Cleaners was a great place, and those guys knew the cleaning business probably as good as anybody. I mean, they were a real cleaner's cleaner, if there is such a term. And they worked hard, and they were very physical, and they had grown up in South Omaha, and Nate was a big guy that I think played probably off tackle for South High School. And they were always getting into fights in the neighborhood with the other various ethnic groups, but Nate was a heck of a guy and a good friend of mine. And his brother's name was Max, and Max left the business and moved to California. And Nate and his wife had children who I really don't know too well, and I think Max never did marry. I can mention others, and probably won't include all. There was another family that had a cleaners. Boasbergs was their name. Bill Boasberg was the father. Leonard Boasberg followed him. He was the son, who's about my age, called Livewire Cleaners, 5005 Underwood Avenue. And they had a huge, big place that was a big-time cleaners at one time, but it's closed now, and they are long gone. And I'm sure Bill is deceased, and Leonard, I think, lives in Pennsylvania. And Leonard never was too much into the business, but and eventually whether they closed up or sold or what, I don't really remember, but they're long gone. And there was a place, there was a family named Theodore that had a cleaners at 26th and Farnham, way back, even before my time. Sam Theodore, I think was his name, and he had a daughter that went to high school about my time named Judy Theodore. They had moved to California, and there was another cleaning plant on South 16th Street. Bill Abraham and Rose helped him at the time, and he was like about 16th and Jackson on the west side of the street. I think it was called Town Talk Cleaners. And way back, even before my time, I think there was a Lutbeg family that had a cleaners on Leavenworth Street, and there was a Minkin, had Peerless Cleaners that was out on 4400 block of North Florence Boulevard, and I didn't really know them. And they sold out to somebody else later on as I came into the picture. And probably leaving somebody out here, but and there was a family down in Lincoln, Jake, I can't think of his name even anymore, but anyway, Jake was a Jewish guy that lived in Lincoln that had a dry cleaners. But I don't think he was he wasn't too religious kind of guy. Anyway, these people all were in the dry cleaning business. Now the tailors, I won't mention names here because I wouldn't want to leave anybody out, but at one time the tailoring business in Omaha was, I don't know, more than half or 80% Jewish. Guys that had come over, mostly men that had come over from Poland and Russia and Czechoslovakia or wherever. And they brought their trade with them, which was tailoring. And most of them needed thread and needles and pins, so they would come to our place, which sold that type of thing. But one time I knew all these guys, and there were many. Well, that's changed a lot. I don't think there's too many. And there may be one or two or three left that are Jewish in Omaha as I speak, but the Orientals came in and sort of took over that business, and there's many Chinese, Japanese, Koreans that do that type of work. And Hispanics, I think, there's probably some, but they're an industry that was once Jewish. The same thing's happened in some cities with the dry cleaning business. Whereas in Chicago and maybe New York, it was very heavily Jewish. That's become Korean. There's like, even the Koreans have taken over, have their own association, and that's almost a complete changeover from being a Jewish industry. One of the companies we did business with, I mentioned Vic Cleaning Machines. Now that was a couple of Jewish guys that lived in Minneapolis, Irving and Oscar Victor. They had, I think their family at one time had owned a cleaners, but they went into making machinery. And they made except for their Val Clean machine, which, to put it bluntly, was a pretty bad machine. But they're down the road, middle, regular dry cleaning, they use it perchloroethylene solvent and petroleum solvents. Now they made a good line of cleaning, and we sold lots of those throughout Nebraska and Iowa, and they're still running today. And if you walk into a drying plant, you'll see Vic dry cleaning machines, which these two brothers, Oscar and Irving Victor, manufactured. They had a big plant, and I'd been up there to visit it and see it. And we used to go up there for sales meetings. Going back to my Uncle Dave, who had the Bishop Freeman Company, and when he passed away, that was taken over by my Uncle Mike, who moved to Omaha, to Chicago from Omaha. He took that over. Then my cousin Harvey Davis, he became the chief operating officer of that until he died. Now his son Steve's got that, and they make things that they sell at the manufacturing level to dry cleaning distributors, and that distribute to products like press plates and padding and carts and things like that. And the original Dave Freeman would be my uncle, had patents on all these. I think the patents have run out, but at one time it was a very lucrative business, and my uncle Dave made a good living at it. And today I'm not sure what shape that business is in, but all I know is that my second cousin Steve Davis is in charge of that, and so he's still in that business. And I mentioned my cousin Skip Neville makes manufactures plastic bags in California, so he's still in that. So there's still a little bit of a carryover there. But I have fun, and hopefully this little interview with Ben will be helpful to somebody down the road. I want to leave a message, not that I hope to be gone real soon, although I did send a list of deceased people the other day, and instead of signing my name, I said, hey, it's going to look like I'm one of them, so I didn't put my name at the end. But I just want everybody to know that we've enjoyed everything that we've done, and hopefully left some kind of a legacy, and hopefully it'll be carried on not only with our kids and our daughter-in-law and the grandchildren, and they have good memories of us, because we certainly had lots of fun with everybody, and we're proud of them, and hope they carry on the name and the tradition of that we've established, and just hope that they have good thoughts of us as the years go on.
Andy Nog, I'm interviewing
June of 1953. And that was my active duty commitment. Then I had a commitment to stay in the reserves, and I was in the reserves till I think about 1965.
And what did you do before you joined the service?
I was a student at University of Michigan, and I got through the ROTC a commission as a second lieutenant. And as the war was on, then you knew right away that you were going to go on active duty. I think I got out of school like in May, and we graduated officially like in June 10th or something, and we got in the car and drove around the country for a while. When I say we, I was married to Joanne at the time, and got orders to go to Selfridge Air Force Base and report.
So you were drafted?
No, it's not called drafted.
It's just part of the ROTC program?
It's part of ROTC. When you, at that time, being as there was a war, you knew that ROTC officers were going to have to go into this service. Just like at West Point. When you get out of West Point, you got a commitment. And our commitment was 2 years.
And where did you go into the service? What base were you on?
I was stationed at Selfridge Air Force Base, which was outside of Detroit, Michigan.
And was that someplace that your wife was allowed to go with you at that time?
Yeah, we rented a little apartment, or I think we lived in part of a house.
So what were your first days in the service like?
They were interesting because we did absolutely nothing. We had all these people that had been called up, and we came into a big room. And we started going through files of reserve people. And everybody that was involved was awaiting for further orders. They were just like a project to keep us busy, and I was there, I think, until maybe 6 weeks. And we didn't do anything. I mean, it was very weird. But
so the job assignment was to go through old files?
Yeah, right. And that's what we did. And finally I got orders to go elsewhere.
And where did you go after that?
That was the greatest thing that ever happened, because I got sent to Offutt Air Base, which of course was right outside of Omaha. And I was assigned to the 3902nd Air Base Wing Headquarters, which was the administrative unit that was running the base. Offutt was the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. And the base was run by this wing. We had I was in the headquarters squadron. We had a food service, a military police, hospital, and maintenance squadrons, and weather squadron, and so on. So, I arrived there, and I'm right at home. We rented an apartment on 31st and Dodge called the Turner Court, and I got on in my car every morning, and I went to work at the base by driving out 13th Street to Offutt. So it was a pretty good situation. I was also lucky in that the people that were in this wing were mostly Omaha people. They had called up the 438th Troop Carrier Wing, which was Omaha people that were officers, and most of them were flyers that had been in World War II, which had ended in 1945, and this was, of course, 1951. So they were called as a unit, and they were going to send them somewhere. Well, they never did. All these guys ended up doing all kinds of jobs out of their career field, and we all managed and we ran the base, I thought, very well. But there was Omaha people all around, some of whom are still friends of mine to this very day.
What was your most memorable experience in the service? Can you think of any one experience?
Oh, I had two things that were really my claim to action. The first had to do with a bottle of ketchup that exploded in the officers' dining room off of General Curtis LeMay was SAC commander then, and he was sitting like at the next table from me, and a bottle of ketchup flew off of his table onto mine and missed my head by a few inches. The other one was a little more serious. In 1952, Omaha was flooded. The Missouri River went over its banks and the airport got flooded. So I was assigned, the troops off it were assigned to fill sandbags and all that, and being an officer, I was a second lieutenant then, I was assigned a staff car and a driver, and I went down and supervised whatever down along the, where the airport is now. That's it. I mean, we never shot anybody, we never saw any North Koreans or South Koreans, but it was the way we fought the war.
So there were no casualties in your unit?
Well, the guy the guy that I worked for that trained me, I became the base classification and assignment officer. In other words, I saw where people were put into the right job. And the guy that trained me and I worked with was named Captain Andrew R. Anderson. And he was a pilot, and to keep their wings and their ratings going, they had to fly airplanes. They had these little two-wing Beechcraft out there, and he took off for Colorado one time and did crash. And so he did get injured, but he wasn't serious, and he survived, and he came back. By the way, his brother was the retired publisher of the World Herald, Harold Anderson.
Were you ever fearful of anything?
Never.
Because you felt you were safe
Never.
where you were?
No, the only time I even carried a gun was when you were officer of the day. You were given a sidearm, which would have been a .45 pistol, and you carried it around with you in a holster and a belt. But I don't think I ever had been taught how to fire it even, but I had it. But that was never, no, it was strictly like working for MUD or OPPD or something.
So these next three questions: how did you pass the time? How did you stay in touch with people? What did you do for recreation? It was like living at home.
That's right.
A normal life.
Absolutely. Of course, I did have some friends that were in the Air Force. There was another Jewish guy that was the base fiscal officer, and his name was Jerry Feblowitz, and he was from Council Bluffs, and he had gone to, I think he had gone to school either at Iowa or some other school, and he and I were friends, and we used to go hunting once in a while for recreation. But other than that, my friends were the same people that I know today. A lot of them lived around the Turner Court and all that. And, you had weekends off. I mean, I was not like out, like, at the time I was in the service, most of my friends had gone to Nebraska. And they were in ROTC, but it was the Army and it was the military police. They were called up, and a lot of them did end over in Korea. People like Orville Milder, Richard Rosenblatt, and Jack Cohen, Justin Horwitz, just to name a few. They were actually, in the trenches, whereas I was strictly an administrative person right here.
Were there any skills or lessons that you learned from your service time that you could carry on into your...
Well, I learned that to get along with people. I was obviously Jewish, and everybody else wasn't, except for Feblowitz, but he was in another building, so I never, I only saw him like for lunch or once in a while. Ironically, the base commander at that time was Colonel Abe J. Beck, and he was Jewish, although I never really knew the guy. I think he belonged to Temple Israel. But with that kind of a name, nobody knew he was Jewish, and the fact that I was Jewish never came up. But I learned to get along with people and to have fun. And of course, we had our parties, and social events. And I would have to say that the core group out there that sort of ran this operation off it at that time was a Colonel Snyder, a Major Moreau, and a Ben Pfeiffer was his name. And these were, some of them were Omaha guys. Eli Dare was a major. And they were really nice to me. I'd have to say that I learned to get along with people, but they made it awful easy on me.
What was your career after the war?
After the war, we had a company called Freeman Company that was down on 14th and Harney, and I had, of course, graduated from college, and I just started going. I went right to work. Never missed a beat, because I had, of course, worked there part-time when I was in high school and college. So.
And what did this entail, this business?
We were a wholesaler of things that went to, sold merchandise to dry cleaners and laundries and tailors. It had started out way back in 1895 as a tailor supply house, but it evolved over the years where we sold things to dry cleaners such as their plastic bags, hangers, filter powder, chemicals, and sewing supplies and so on. And then at that time we started like a new part because of the shortage of equipment during the war. We started distributing equipment, so we became the Nebraska-Iowa distributor for several lines of equipment like pressing machines and boilers and so on, and later developed a franchise that was called 1 Hour Sunkist Cleaners, where we would lay out a plant, put it all together, find a location, and sell it as a package. And we did that throughout the Midwest, not only in Nebraska, but also in far away as Indiana, Arkansas, places like that.
Did your experiences in the service contribute to your thinking on war and military service
Well,
in current times?
I feel that, this is a country that the guys in World War II, which a lot of whom are around here now and they're friends of mine and people that I know, and I think they really, they really put in and they gave for their country. I had two uncles in the military, and I always felt you sort of owed it. At that time, there was people felt they loved their country, and nobody wants to get shot at, but if you gotta go, you gotta go, and you should be proud of it.
Are you a member of any veterans or other organizations related to your service?
Yes, I belong to Post Number 1, American Legion, 78th, in Wakely in Omaha.
Do you have reunions? I know you're still in touch with a lot of these guys, but
no, I don't. We've never had any
really
reunions.
aren't.
No, there's a couple guys that I was in the 39 segment with. I still play tennis with, but other than that, no reunions. Most guys it's another world.
So your practice as a Jew was not in any way
Never.
curtailed or
No.
or imposed on in any way?
No.
Because you were home.
That's correct.
Do you have anything else you want to say about your
Well, I
military
stayed in
service?
there was an obligation to, I think you had to stay in 8 years, and I stayed in to 65, which gave me, 14 years. And I ended up a captain. And to put our time in, we had to go and we had to train and study and do that. We went to Fort Omaha. So I was driving out there, I really don't remember how often you had to go. I think it was once a week. I think it was once a week when I drove out there and we took class. It was sort of boring, but I put my time in, and eventually it got so boring that I thought, hey, I've had it. I don't need it. I'm reading the same thing over and over again, and I resigned and got an honorable discharge as a captain in the reserves. So that was my Korean War experience.
That was your experience. We thank you very much for your time today, and this completes our interview.
Well, it was a pleasure. Sandy, it was a real pleasure.